Good evening, everybody. My name is Arina. It's my pleasure to welcome all of you at the opening of our festival. The festival is a bridge between the business program of the Forum and our cool weekend, which we're going to officially open tomorrow night. And on Saturday, Sunday, we're going to see you at more than 100 events, lectures, debates, workshops, concerts, showings. So please make sure you come and attend all these places. Tonight, we were expected to have an interview of Richard Sennett, a world-famous sociologist, to be conducted by Ekaterina Shulman. Unfortunately, for health reasons, Mr. Sennett couldn't make it to Moscow. He is very sorry about it, but we'll try to contact him using electronic means of communication. So we're going to call him in his London home. Let us do everything possible to cheer Ekaterina and Richard. Ekaterina is going to deliver a lecture on the stationary mobility in the city. Let's give a round of applause to Ekaterina. She will be alone on this stage tonight. And thank you, everybody.
Okay. Can you hear me? Wave if you can hear me. Okay. I'm very sorry I can't be with you in Moscow today, but I hope that this is a beginning of a talk that maybe we can continue by you reading books. I'm going to talk to you about this particular, which I have just published, which is a book about the relation between how people live in cities and how cities are designed. The book is called Building and Dwelling, Ethics for the City, and it embodies thinking I've done over a long period of time, but also work that I've done for the United Nations on urban development. So it is a book about Western cities and cities in the emerging cities in the developing world. I thought what I would start with saying tonight is something about the relationship between these two words, building and dwelling. They have a root in urbanism. What the French call ville and cité. A ville originally was the whole city, and the cité was a small part of the city, what we would call a neighborhood. As the word developed in the 17th century, the ville became the kind of built form of the city, and the cité became a more anthropological and political term about how people live in cities. Ideally, today, we would think that how cities are built should be a matter of how people want to live. If only it were so simple. We found in work in the United Nations, and probably you know this as well from Russian cities, that the most popular building form is what's called a gated community. That is the city that excludes people who are not like the residents of the city. It's a place of segregation, of isolation. That's the most popular kind, if people have a choice about building, the most popular thing they want. Should we build it? I don't think so. I don't think that as urbanists, our job should be to help people avoid people unlike themselves, but rather bring them together. And I mention this to you because I found in my own practice that there is a kind of asymmetry between building and dwelling, between cité and ville, and that oftentimes as urbanists, the ethical things we have to do are not building community, but disrupting it, not giving people more of a sense of security, but giving them more a sense of exposure to difference. So that this is an asymmetric relationship. Of course, normally, we want people, we want habitable structures that people want to live in. But what they want is sometimes something that is unjust. So that is basically that asymmetry, that tension, is what I try to explore in my book. I don't have an answer to it, but I have a way of proceeding to explore it, to make it a deeper issue. And that is by making a distinction between open cities and closed cities. I argue for the open city, and I argue against the closed city in urban planning. The open city is something that we've known in the past. The closed city is something that dominates our sense of what a city should be today. The open city has a better quality of life than the closed city, but it is a quality of life which is uncertain, which is entrepreneurial, which takes risks rather than makes people feel comfortable, that they know what they want, that they are living in a place that offers them no challenges. My idea about this comes from the time that I spent, the decades I spent at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where I teach urban studies. When I first went there, my office was next to the Media Lab at MIT, this great creative place that spawned so many of the technologies we have today. And in the Media Lab, people contrasted, they took lots of money from Microsoft, but they contrasted the way Microsoft thinks with the way the Media Lab thinks. Microsoft, in those days, as today, thought in terms of a closed system. They wanted to test out hypotheses, find what worked and didn't work, choose the experiments that did work, and build software on that basis. The people in the Media Lab, although they took the money of Microsoft, had incredible contempt for this closed way of proceeding. They were interested instead in possibilities, in things that were outside the box, in things that were difficult to measure, new things, experimental things. They were more interested in why things failed than in why things succeeded. And that is the idea of an open way of experiment. The one is hypothesis testing. It's secure. You know what you're getting, what works, what doesn't. The other is truly experimental. You think outside the box. You want to know what's new, and that's open. So I live next to these people in the Media Lab who seem never to sleep, who were making all these innovations. And I thought, aha, we have to apply this to the city. We have to find some ways to make cities which are experimental, open, rather than closed cities, which are places where we know what the environment is like. You know what you're getting. And my book is a way of exploring that possibility. I would say to you that that a closed city has two features of a closed system. The first feature is that it's additive. That is, that you take a building and you multiply it by 10, 15, 20 times, and you think you've made an urban development. You know all of that kind of building from the Soviet era of creating housing around Moscow. We know it originally. Its source was Le Corbusier's Plan Voisin of 1924, in which you repeat the same building over and over and over again. Le Corbusier loved this because he thought that it made a rational city, a city that worked like a machine. In fact, what that kind of building does is that the environment becomes a sum of its parts. You add up the number of structures you make, and that's the environment. And it has the feature of all closed systems of being additive. An open system, by contrast, is one in which the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. That when you put different elements together, they interact in a way so that you produce something bigger than those elements. Think about how this works in a market. In a market, you create growth economically by putting in different elements which compete and conspire with each other, and you get something which is an economic product which is more than the sum of its parts. That's how all good markets operate. It's the principle of synergy. You know this from economics. We don't do that in planning. We don't try and exploit the synergies, the interactions that different forms of building put together can take. So my idea of an open city is how to create places which are greater than the sum of its parts because the parts interact, rather than how to create an additive version of the city, how to get synergy rather than additivity. The second aspect of a closed city is that there is a tight bond between form and function. You say this is an office building, and the planner or the architect like me then says, okay, what do we need to do to build an office building with these given specifications? We do that under capitalism all the time, global capitalism. People buy specifications. That's how most of the investment in the Middle East in in cities in the West. I don't know for Moscow, but certainly in London and Paris. So there's a tight fit between form and function. It seems great. This is very efficient. But the problem is, what happens if the function of then the form adaptive, and often it isn't. I give you an example of this in my planning work in Beijing. You know that in the 90s that there was a one-child policy in China. Thought they had too many people. And so we built in Beijing tens of thousands of units for families with one child and two parents. Now, the population in China is aging. They need bigger families. They want 2 or even 3 child families. But the buildings that we made are too rigid. It's cheaper, actually. It's very hard to reconfigure them. It's cheaper than to tear them down and start all over, which is a terrible waste. So a looser fit between form and function means that a building can have a history, that people's lives, how they dwell, their changes in their lives can be reflected in the way buildings are made. I give you another example of this at another extreme. In Masdar, which is a smart city in the Emirates, the roads have been built, precisely engineered to deal with a certain kind of smart car with a big battery in the back. That's how they were designed 16 years ago. By last year, we know how to shrink the batteries of cars, make them lighter, and make the cars smaller than these monsters that were people on the road. The roads are dysfunctional. The lanes are too wide. They're not built for an advance in the technology of driving. In that case, what it means is that a closed system, when there is a tight fit between form and function, risks technological obsolescence. You understand what I mean? Just the way that when there's too tight a fit in housing between how people live and what you build, that you risk something that becomes obsolete. So that is the second big argument for open versus closed ways of making a city. These are all quality of life issues. That is, if you live in a rigid, predetermined environment, you have, in my view, a poorer quality of life than if you live in a looser, more open environment, even though things like emotions like anxiety, not knowing what's going to happen next, how to do something, how to use the environment, all of these are, you will experience. You won't be happy. A good quality environment is not one in which people think, oh, it's so nice, I just know what's happening. I feel so good, so secure. That's a bad quality environment, in my view. I want to say to you something about, since I'm running out of time, I am very long-winded. I want to say something to you about larger urban scale. An open urban environment has, at a larger scale, has porosity between the different parts of the city. Think about what an urban edge is. The edge, say, between housing, and schools, or public and private. In a closed system, that edge will be a hard edge. As in a gated community. You can't get in or out easily. In an open system, edges are porous, and the planner's goal is to try to create more and more porosity between the different parts so they can interact. I give you an example from New York City, from which I came before I fled to Britain. In New York City, there is a street on the upper side of the city in which on one side of the street is very poor, Latino, it's called Spanish Harlem. The other side of the street is the beginning of the richest neighborhood in the world, called the Upper East Side. And this street is a boundary between them. I made a terrible mistake when I was planning commissioner of New York. I had the opportunity to make a street market for Spanish Harlem, and I put it in the center of the community rather than on 96th Street. I should have put that on the boundary to make the ghetto and this rich place more porous. People would go there to shop. They wouldn't talk to each other. They wouldn't necessarily, but they'd be physically in the presence of each other. And that's the kind of planning I think we need to do more of today. The practical application of that is that we have to rethink how we build road systems, because most of our road systems create these hard borders. It's hard to cross the highway of 12 lanes or of 8 lanes. We need to rethink the whole transport system so that we can make the edges within cities more porous. The other thing I want to say to you about this has to do with this distinction between open and closed, with the work that I do now at the United Nations. I am trying to put together the work that we do on urban development with the work we also do on climate change. How to make a city that can deal, how to make urban designs for cities that are facing climate change. As you may know, there are two models for this. One is adaptive, and the other is mitigating. We need to do both. Mitigation means reducing the amount of traffic, for instance, carbon traffic within the city, getting rid of gasoline cars, making the city more compact so that people don't have to drive so much. That is what mitigation of a good sort looks like. Adaptation is finding ways to live with a hotter, and in your case in Moscow, a much drier world, because you are facing problems of what is technically called desertification. In 20 years, you're not going to have the water that Moscow needs. The open and closed issue here is very fuzzy, very ambiguous. But at the error when we think about climate change on the mitigation side is that we can build our way out of climate change. That is to say that in New York, for instance, that we could build seawalls that would keep away extreme weather conditions. For you, it would be that you could find take water from 200, 300, 400 miles from Moscow in order to solve the climatological water shortage that you're going to have in the Moscow basin. In other words, that somehow you could resist climate change. This is wrong. What we need is more of an emphasis that's wrong because it assumes that you can create a closed system that shuts out climate change. We need to think more adaptively about how we will live in a hotter, for you, drier world. How will we adapt to that? In the case of, say, Chinese cities, it means that people will drive less. For you, it might mean that that you redesign the way you make buildings so that they are naturally air-cooled, that you use heat pumps, which take water out of, which take heat out of the ground to heat buildings in the winter. You are working with a climate change rather than resisting it. And that, in my work at the UN, I am trying to explore ways in which we can have better adaptive strategies, even while we pursue necessary forms of mitigation, like fewer gasoline-powered cars and less energy use. To conclude, this is again a question of quality of life. A sustainable quality of life into what's going to happen with climate change in the next 30 years, you all look young, so you'll see this, I won't, is that people will learn to live with less. It's a huge difference in mentality. They will adapt, and in adapting, they will learn to live with less. What we cannot continue to do is think that we can consume as we consume now because we can build our way out of climate change. That's what Donald Trump thinks. That's the fantasy of Donald Trump. Don't think that way. Think like a realist. Don't think like an ostrich with its head in the ground. Think like somebody who is looking around. And that I think is the quality of life issue there. So I'm running out of time. Just to summarize, what I've tried to describe to you in this short talk is a relationship between building and dwelling. It's rooted in an old French distinction between the cité and the ville. It's a very fraught, asymmetric, difficult relationship because many of the ways in which people want to live are ways they shouldn't live. And you can now see with the climate change issue the same thing that I presented to you initially about gated communities. A way of grappling with this problem, not solving it, is to make a contrast between closed and open cities. Closed cities reflect a closed system which is additive and which has a tight fit between form and function. Open cities are synergistic. The whole is more than the sum of the parts. And in that play of different elements, there's a loose fit between form and function. That's at the level of the building. And by the way, that loose fit is reflected in buildings which are incomplete forms, like the buildings Alejandro Aravena makes for Chilean housing, half-built, three-quarter-built buildings, or the buildings that we are trying to make in London around the Olympic site. They're not finished. They're not totalized. That reflects itself at urban scale, first of all, in the kind of porosity at the edges between places. We want to have open borders inside cities just the way, as good Europeans, I must say, we want to have open borders between countries. And it reflects itself, the issue that, as I told you, I'm concerned with at the UN, it reflects itself in how we think about climate change in its relation to cities. We need both mitigation and adaptation. But mitigation poses the threat that we think we can build ourselves out of having to deal with climate change. Shut it out, create seawalls which push the sea away, or transport water in ways that means we don't have to consume less of it. We need a closed form of mitigation. We need to think more about ways of working with climate change, about adapting even when we work in the city, so that, for instance, in the summer we work at night, and during the winter we work in the day when there's more, in rough climates, when there's more natural heat available. It's again a quality of life issue, because what we need to do in climate change is learn how to live with less. That's a better quality of life than trying to live in a way in which change is not happening. So these are my thoughts. They're in this book. I don't know when it will be in Russian, but it will be soon. And I hope I'm sorry again, I can't be with you in Moscow, but if you're ever in London, you should come to the London School of Economics and look me up. Thank you very much.
На сцену приглашается политолог.
I would like to give the floor to a political scientist, assistant professor of the Russian Presidential Academy of National Economy and Public Administration, Ekaterina Shulman. Good evening. Thank you very much for coming here. Thank you very much for being so patient. Well, we planned it a little bit different. If Richard Sennett could come here, we would have talked to him in person, of course, because he's not here. I do not have his support and his authority on the one hand, but on the other hand, I do have a little bit more time to talk about what's interesting for me. I am a political scientist, therefore all of the issues of urban life, urban changes and the transformations that people who live in cities undergo are interested for me, not because of urban studies, but because of political environments. You heard the speech of Richard Sennett, in which he underlined his main ideas. This is the opposition between ville and cité, between a closed and an open city. He also talked about his ideas about urban buildings having less of a specialized function because their functions change all the time. He talked about the climate change and the resulting social and consumer changes. So all of that should lead to consuming less or to practice conscious consumption and not to use up so many resources. Of course, when the Russian audience is told they shouldn't wish for a safe environment, they should step out of their comfort zone, they should be challenged by their environment, that of course creates a lot of resistance. Russian people think that they've never enjoyed a safe space, so they were never fully in the comfort zone. Therefore, it would be immoral to step out of the comfort zone. But of course, it is clear what is the idea behind it. And of course, here I must agree that closed systems are of the devil. Closed systems is the recipe for disaster. When we have a monopoly, when we have excessive control, then we will have hell on our hands. A closed system starts creating violence, and it starts producing and replicating violence externally. A prison, a secret sister, a dorm for specially gifted children, a monastery, all of these closed systems breed evil. That's why I wanted to talk about the topic that you could see a second ago on the screen. I want to talk about mobility in cities and immobility or permanence in cities. What is openness? What does it mean to be open? Being open means that everybody is free to move. It is the ability to see and be seen.
So the mobility, visibility are the main features of open systems and, by extension, open cities. We believe we're living in a time of high speed, high transition, high movement, high-speed movements, fast movements. That's the case. All kinds of resources that in previous centuries were stationary or immobile are becoming increasingly liquid in the literal sense of the word, liquid. What kind of resources are we talking about? There are four resources: people, goods, money, and information. These four types of resources are becoming increasingly fluid. People move around cheaper and easier than before. Goods are being moved around in greater quantities and over greater distances than ever before. A well-known phrase that a sea cargo container has transformed the world more than the internet. Our diet has been transformed as a result of the fact that all kinds of seasonal products are available throughout the year. Maybe we should put an end to that, but it's another issue. So people, goods, money, universal currencies, international markets, easiness of moving money around between countries and continents, and information or cultural treasures, cultural values, similar leisure activities in different countries, several universal languages. Unfortunately, the humanity hasn't reached one common language as the creators of Esperanto dreamed, but we have 5 basic languages people use to understand each other and communicate among each other. So within the city, if we go down to the urban level, we also witness an increasing easiness of movement. Talking about this, I would like to recall one thing. In the previous centuries and decades, and relatively recently, urban transit was incredibly costly. Before the arrival of mass transit, people, only wealthy people could move around. All others only can rely on their own feet. If you recall the Russian, French, or English classical literature, you can remember all the difficulties associated with the necessity to hire carts and other means of transport. Madame Bovary and other novels. It was incredibly expensive. Nobody could afford to commute to work and from work using the means of transport available at that time. The arrival of mass transit in the middle of the 19th century made this easier. So we had taxi cabs, we had mass transportation. When we read in the books of the 20s, 30s, last century about this monster streetcar where people quarrel, fight with one another, people get run over by a streetcar, it's a big thing. It was a big thing for them. It was a big news for them. It allowed people to move around conveniently, because prior to that, this closeness and the necessity of living in a closed society, closed area, it was a given. So against this backdrop of the growing mobility, looking forward, we might anticipate pilotless taxis, and we might even end up having flying pilotless taxis. And this would allow people to travel over any distances. Tickets will become increasingly cheaper. So that this is one side of our new mobility we're facing. But there's another side based on the sociological data we have. Not so much data, survey data, but rather research data, research findings. The big data findings provided by mobile operators. Recently, such study results were made available, partially available in Moscow. Very interesting results. So mobile operators provide information on an anonymous basis, information tracing the movement of SIM cards within the city. So what lessons can we draw from that data? Within the city, about 25 million people move around every day. So it's not the population of Moscow, but these are the active people, people active in the day. And this signifies the extension of distributed way of life, whereby people overnight outside of the city and then move back to the city for work. And we also see that a lot of people are still have to go through this city center in order to reach outlying neighborhoods and districts of the city. This should interest urbanists and city planners. What I care about is that despite of these huge masses of people that move around the city, the stable ratio of people, 2/3, never leave the bounds of their districts or neighborhoods. A couple years ago, sociologists were telling me about this mysterious silent majority, the invisible 80%. 80% of city dwellers, that never express themselves socially, other than that in the capacity of workers or shoppers. So they work in the day, they go back home in the evening, they buy food near their home, and then they sleep, and then they go back to work the next day. Even if they have a cultural center next to their dwelling, they don't visit it. This applied more to elderly people, and sociologists were telling me that ladies after the age of 45, they're becoming invisible, and it doesn't mean that they died because the length of life for women is higher than for men. So if it means that there's a high number of people, a large stratum of people that don't use this mobility. And they're also making use of the new technologies. We're saying that it's not good when everybody's commuting from suburbia to the downtown. We are saying that the regions should have all infrastructure, cultural infrastructure, work infrastructure. We're saying that it's good when people can work next to their homes. Of course, nobody is keen to spend many hours commuting in the public transportation or in the car. People say that Russian consumers prefer to move around in their cars because they feel safe in their little bubble. Still, we are developing dormitory areas. That's a great thing. We are developing online and delivery systems. You can get whatever you want delivered to your door. So all these trends, all these technologies, I'm working to make you stationed, anchored somewhere, motionless. Another thing, we are fighting against cars. The current sociological thought, the main train of thought is that cars are an evil, they are polluting, the main source of pollution in the cities, car exhausts. I'm not going to go into chemical components, so car exhausts, the main source of pollution, and also particles of tires are the second source of pollution. And of course, the industrial cities of the second world to which we belong, they are facing the most most acute problem of this kind, because common access goods can be secured through political means. In order to have clean air in the city, we need to introduce, we need to regulate the exhaust, we need to limit the use of cars, and we need to have an opportunity to impose environmental standards on enterprises, on cars, on plants and factories. Otherwise, but in the second world cities, you can buy everything with the exception of clean air and clean water. As I said, car is a source of pollution, and it kills people on top of things. And second world cities are also in the lead here. Unfortunately, there's a direct correlation between the number of bicycles, reverse correlation between the number of bicycles and car accident deaths or vehicular accident deaths. So the more bicycles we have, the fewer car accidents and mortality rate related to car accidents we have. If you look at the developed countries, capital cities in developed countries, Rome is the only place that can compete with Moscow in terms of the poor quality of air and high number of car accidents. So getting back to the idea of mobility, city authorities are restricting car traffic and terrorizing, harassing motorists, making the car ownership more costly, less convenient, encouraging people to walk along broad boulevards and sidewalks or bike. In northern countries, it's quite problematic because it's very difficult to cycle if the sun doesn't shine for 8 months in the year. But somehow people in Oslo and Helsinki and other Nordic cities, they resolve this issue, but they have a very well-developed and cheap public transit system. So getting back to the main idea, these measures, correct or unavoidable, inevitable, we're also hampering the mobility. We are pushing people to stay at home or to stay in their respective residential areas, trying to make sure that he can use all the services he needs without having to travel to other areas of the city, without causing transport problems, without having to drive in his car. This is changing the employment, urban employment. We're moving from industrial employment to post-industrial employment. Why commuting was a feature by the 21st century. People were working at the factories, and they were living outside of the cities, working in the factories in the cities. So while the workers were working at the factories, the kids were taken care of by the state. Then the workers would come back home, would spend their meager leisure hours at home. What's happening now? Still people commuting from outlying regions or districts to the downtown area, but the increasing number of people are using Skype, electronic mail to work. Only they go to the center only in exceptional cases, spending most of their time at home. What does it lead to? It leads to completely different requirements to the livable environment. So in addition to just spending the night at home, people want to have a park, coffee shops, a movie theater, a library, cultural facilities, and other beautiful things in the places they live and work. This leads to improved quality of the environment and to the deterioration of mobility. So employment, the transformation of employment is leading to these consequences. So if we were to extend it to the horizon, we'll probably end up having a society from the Wall-E cartoon. Remember those overweight people who were flying around in their big chairs because they were too fat to move, and they were entertained. They were served food and drinks. Clearly, social trends never follow the direct line. So to claim or argue that people will never leave their homes because everything will be delivered to their doorsteps, it's really too stretched. But speaking about the combination of mobility and stationarity, this might lead to deurbanization. If you don't have to be present at work for many hours, people might opt to move outside of the city and live there. The same is happening in Moscow, the Moscow region. If we were to look at the data of the cell operators, we will see that people are leaving Moscow. In the summer months, the population of Moscow city proper and the Moscow region become equal. The only difference is that if in other countries, cities, this relocation to suburbia means a relocation to low-rise buildings, in our case, that means to the relocation to high-rise buildings, to apartment blocks, because people move outside of Moscow not to enjoy their lives more, but to live in a cheaper place, even though the air is still better outside. So we shouldn't assume that people will be cooped up in a bubble, a cocoon. There's a notion in Japan, hikikomori, the people, the shut-ins, the hermits who are cooped up in their apartments, never leave their apartments, order food online. We're going to see an increase in this type of people who want to be left alone. And as Richard Sennett said, those people would restrict their consumption, limit their consumption, so that they don't have to come into contact with the outside world. But it's not going to be a mass phenomenon. But when we talk about our time as the time of high rate of change and high speeds, it's a one-sided view, lopsided view. Of course, the internet speed is expanding and the speed of cellular phones is expanding. On the other hand, we're seeing a certain viscosity of social processes, and social transformations were a lot more quicker and a lot more forced in the 20th century. If we say that we're going to have this in 20 years and that in 30 years, we need to keep in mind that social processes are marked by viscosity. It's going to be affected by lower violence, higher.
If you cannot cut out the social stratum that resists your idea, then maybe these changes will not actually happen. Therefore, that is something that we should take into account when we do our forecasts. But to summarize, I would like maybe postulate some trivial things. When we talk about Russia, the migration in Russia usually happens when people migrate from smaller towns to bigger towns, and from there to metropolitan areas. So our large cities will continue to get larger and larger, barring hunger or a war. Therefore, the Moscow agglomeration will grow, St. Petersburg will grow, and same is true for Krasnodar agglomeration. What about reverse migration? Who are the people leaving Moscow? Usually we're talking about people of an advanced age who move out of Moscow to the neighboring areas. People see these areas as a possible, comfortable place to live. Let's say they move to the town of Tver, no, they move out to towns or cities with warmer climates like Krasnodar. At the same time, we see that there is an inflow of people from all cities in Russia to Moscow. Should we, therefore, increase the density of population in Moscow? I know people talked about this problem during the urban forum today. But, of course, if we compare the density of population in large cities of the second world, such as China, Bangladesh, or India, and then, of course, there is still room for Moscow to grow. The other question is, do we really need it? And so we cannot truly restrain this mobility if we do not live in a totalitarian state. People will continue to come and live in Moscow. And so what should be a situation that we should prevent? We should prevent ghettoization of a poor district, which really repeats what Richard Sennett said. We should also try to avoid creating greenhouses that will breed future evil, and we should avoid building high-rises in the middle of nowhere with no infrastructure. That will be a gateway to hell. It will not be a city or an environment. That will be a hellish landscape with a single high-rise rising in the middle of it. Even a very large density of skyscrapers that we see in Shanghai, that is actually much better than when we try to stick to our insulation system, which creates a lot of problems. We have empty spaces that breed violence and crime. Therefore, we end up with a closed system, a system where people will never know their neighbors, a system where people will never have a community, a system where we will have a lot of rotation of residents. More affluent people will move out, poorer people will move in. Therefore, this type of development will breed a lot of evil. If you pass by these developments in a car, then of course it is horrifying to imagine what would happen to them in case of fire. I do hope that this never happens, but let's remember, if we talk about new developments, new construction, new district, that God forbid that we build it in such a square way. That is not a city. That's an anti-city. It is a closed system. There is lack of cohesion. There is a gap in communication between environments and dwelling. Thank you very much.